Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us. We're here today for a very special reason. We have the launch of Jane Waldfogel's new book, Child Benefits, Smart Investment in America's Children. This is a topic that I'm personally always very happy to talk about and always very interested in, but it's actually the release is coming at a particularly timely moment as Congress is in the midst of debating a massive tax bill that has the potential to really shape the US tax and safety net and impacts on children for a number of years. So very timely indeed. So that being said, we can get started. My name is Megan Curran. I'm the policy director with the Center on Poverty and Social Policy. We're based in the Columbia School of Social Work. The Center on Poverty and Social Policy researches poverty, and we also research, how it impacts children, families, and communities, and the impact that social policy decisions have on those same folks. So we pay close attention to a wide range of things that happen at the local, state, and federal policy level. And one of the biggest issues that we've paid attention to and done quite a lot of research on for the past number of years has been the child tax credit, which we will hear a lot about today. In addition to our center, this event is proudly co-hosted by the Columbia Population Research Center, the Columbia School of Social Work as a whole, and the SEPA Institute of Politics, of Global Politics Women's Initiative. So thank you so much to all our co-hosts, and thanks again for everyone joining us here today. So the main event here is Jane Waldfogel herself. She is the Compton Foundation Centennial Professor for the Prevention of Children and Youth Problems, based here at the Columbia School of Social Work. She's an expert on child and family policy, and we're just so glad to be here in conversation today. So first things first, a book is a big deal, so we'll just acknowledge that. And massive congratulations on the release. Can you just tell us what was your inspiration for writing on this topic?
Thanks, Megan. Thank you for moderating, doing this conversation with me. Thanks everybody for being here. I've been interested in child benefits for a long time and have always been struck, as others have been, by the fact that the United States is the only wealthy country that doesn't have a child benefit. But I was also struck increasingly at how much we were moving towards a child benefit and how live an issue it's been in the last several years. And so it just seemed a really good moment to bring together the evidence, thinking that, if the evidence was there, then policymakers would have it available. And so it just seemed a good moment to do this.
So the term child benefit, obviously it's the title of the book. Folks who kind of research and think about this issue all the time are quite familiar with the term, but it's not necessarily something that we use all the time in the US. It's not necessarily the term that you'd hear in Congress as they're debating the tax bill right now. So maybe you could just define what exactly that term stands and whether or not.
No, really good question. So these things go by, some people call them child benefits, some people use the term child allowances, some people use family allowances. So these are policies that have been in place for over 100 years around the world, and they're universal or almost universal. They go to all families with children. The more children you have, the more benefits you get, and they're not conditional on parental employment. So they're not welfare programs. They're not about welfare to work. They're about supporting families with children. And they're delivered typically monthly, sometimes even more frequently. So they're benefits that go to every child in a country, and they've been around forever.
And so when we say forever, like, are we talking about the last sort of 20, 30 years or the last 50 years or?
No, I had so much fun reading the history of child benefits. I thought I knew a lot about child benefits, but doing the work for the book, I felt like I learned so much more. So no, these go back more than 100 years to Belgium and France, when employers were looking at their employees and they were noticing that, they had a wage that was adequate for typically a male worker. And then he would get married, and then it was covering two people. And then the family would start having children. And at some point, the family was falling further and further into economic insecurity or hardship because he was earning the same wages. And it wasn't really reasonable that employers should pay more to people because they had more children. That's not really going to work out well for firms. And so they started setting aside separate payments called family allowances. And employees literally would get a different pay envelope. So they'd get a pay envelope with their pay, and they'd get a separate envelope with their family allowance. And that was the extra benefit for their children. And then that turned into a public benefit in France and Belgium. And at the same time, other countries like New Zealand and Australia were implementing the same kind of policies. But that's, 100 years ago.
Right.
And they've now diffused to the point where 2/3 of the countries around the world have some form of child benefit. And if you look at our peer countries in the OECD, the wealthy countries, all of them have a child benefit, either universal or nearly universal. There's only one country that isn't universal that says, well, you have to work in order to qualify for these benefits, leaving out the lowest income families who don't have enough earnings. That's the United States.
So the United States, obviously, some folks might be much more familiar with it in recent years because I think it kind of really pierced the public consciousness, which is the child tax credit, during COVID, and we'll get into some of that piece. But so on the face of it, the child tax credit sounds like could be child benefit. It kind of says it in the name. But you're saying that basically the U.S. is an outlier. So is the child tax credit technically like what you would call a child benefit, or does it fall a bit short?
So the child tax credit is not a child benefit, but it could be. So if we extended it to all families with children, if we delivered it monthly, if we decoupled it from employment and earnings, that would be a child benefit. And so when we think about in the United States the potential to have a child benefit, that's what most of us think about, is extending the child tax credit, making it more generous and extending its eligibility. As it currently exists, the child tax credit only serves families who meet its earnings requirement, and then you get more benefits as your earnings increase. So if you don't have earnings or you have low earnings, you don't get the full benefit. So currently the child tax credit is $2,000 per child. And I think many people would think, oh, okay, so then everybody's getting $2,000 per child. And that's not the case. So 25% of children, 1 in 4 children, are not getting $2,000 per child. And astonishingly, the children who aren't getting it are the lowest income children. Now, some countries exclude the highest income children because if they feel like it's, why would you transfer money to very wealthy families? We exclude the lowest income children. So that's the way in which the child tax credit is not a child benefit. I mean, the other big difference is it's paid as a lump sum once a year at tax time. And that really does make a difference in terms of family budgeting. We're all familiar with there's a cycle of families pay a lot to get the kids back to school in the fall, then there's the holidays, then families fall behind on their bills in January, February, while they wait for the EITC, the big lump sum, and the child tax credit. And that creates hardship. Families fall behind in their bills, and when they receive those payments, they're paying back bills and they're paying for necessities. And it would be much easier to budget if you receive the money month to month, or even in some countries, even more frequently than that.
Yeah, because some are actually like every 2 weeks or something.
Yeah.
So obviously, we understand that the U.S. child tax credit doesn't quite meet the standards of what we'd call a child benefit and what so many other countries have. We did actually quite recently have a big expansion of the child tax credit that did a lot of these things. It was a temporary thing. But I know we're going to get into some of the evidence that's in the book, and some of the evidence actually does relate to what happened a couple of years ago. So I don't know if you want to just walk through, like, the child tax credit hasn't always been $2,000 per child since it was enacted. And it also actually was even more than that, like, just recently. So have there been kind of big changes like over time, and what are the ones that stood out the most to you?
I mean, I guess what strikes me about the history of the child tax credit is that it's been progressively expanded over the course of the last 30 years, but also how bipartisan it's been. So the child tax credit, here's a trivia question. Who first proposed the child tax credit back in 1994? Actually, a lot of people in this room know the answer. Newt Gingrich, Republican Speaker of the House, part of the contract with America. And it was $400 per child when it was first enacted, I think in 1997. And then it became more generous, raised to, I think, $1,000 under Bush, made partly refundable, meaning that you could get it even if you had low earnings and didn't have that large a tax liability. And then we've all heard President Trump talk about how he doubled the value in his first administration. That's true. Up to $2,000 per child, but up as high as $2,000 per child. And Trump also extended it up the income distribution. So up until before then, really high income families were not eligible, and now they are, except the top 2 or 3% at the top. Um, and then during the Biden administration, it was temporarily extended and made much more generous and paid out monthly for 6 months. And that was the period during which it really looked like a child benefit. And unfortunately, when Congress considered making that extension permanent, they failed to do that by one vote. And so, yeah, it's a sad moment. And so then it reverted to its previous value of 2,000 per child once a year. That is part of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. So that's now expiring this year. And so doing something with the child tax credit is part of the big bill that's in Congress currently. And so you probably all read that there's a proposal to raise its value to as much as 2,500 per child. And that's in the House side. We don't know yet what'll happen in the Senate side.
So I think what I'd love to actually have you walk us through is a little bit about just the wealth of research that went into trying to understand what both the US, child tax credit does, but actually all of the other types of benefits that are kind of true child benefits. What they say, because in the title, I think the title is kind of a giveaway of maybe your conclusion, which is that it's a smart investment. And so just to actually unpack like why it would be considered a smart investment, it's like good to understand just exactly what does the evidence base say.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest,
So I should probably just
Yeah.
say where the evidence comes from, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So the evidence in the book draws from two main sources. So one source is research in OECD countries, the wealthy countries. So there's 38 members of the OECD. So I include every study that exists from an OECD country. So it's not like cherry picked, there's one really great study and I'm going to talk about that. So it's the entire body of research from OECD countries on the effects of child benefits, but especially emphasizing, studies that use large nationally representative data sets that use causal research designs. Although I do also include some qualitative studies and some smaller studies. And then from the United States, we have a wealth of evidence from the expansion in 2021. So the expanded child tax credit, which you've reviewed several times in the research roundups that you did at the Poverty Center. And then there's a little bit of evidence from other US programs that are similar. So historical expansions of mothers' pensions or food stamps. I try to be really careful in the book not to use evidence that's not relevant and not be drawing on all kinds of different programs. But in some cases, it's really useful to bring in some other programs, and I explain where I do that and why.
I guess one of the probably most logical questions that people have when they're kind of um, either told about child benefits for the first time or when they heard about the expansion of the 2021 child tax credit is, this is flexible cash for families. It's no strings attached. And so I think a lot of people tend to say, but researchers also tend to ask as well, how do families spend this money
Yeah.
once they get it?
Yeah.
And so what did you find across all of the countries that you were looking at? Was it consistent? Were there results going in different directions?
So the results are amazingly consistent. So I think there's like 20 studies in the OECD countries, and the results are incredibly consistent. So parents spend the money on items for children. So books, toys, clothing, footwear, musical instruments. I didn't really know that until I did this research. Education items, items for children. And they also spend money on family necessities. So housing is a big item. Transportation is a big item. Another really consistent finding from the research in the OECD countries is that families don't spend the money on alcohol or tobacco. And in fact, there's some evidence that spending on alcohol and tobacco goes down when families receive more benefits. So why would that be? So if people are using alcohol and tobacco because they're stressed, because of financial strain, you could see how being less stressed might lead you to use less alcohol and tobacco. But I found that really interesting because I had found that result in research that I'd done in the UK, and I hadn't seen it before in the literature. And the government was thrilled about it. It's like, oh my God, parents are spending the money on things for children and not alcohol and tobacco. And I wasn't never sure if that was a unique finding to the UK setting, but it's actually present in other studies. The research, you know this from the research roundups that you did, the research from the United States is quite consistent with that. So, I mean, there's dozens of studies of how families spent the money in the 2021 expansion. And again, families spend the money on books and toys, clothing, footwear, items for children. In the United States, they also spend the money on childcare and after school care, which you don't see in the European countries because parents don't buy childcare and after school care because it's publicly subsidized. Families also spend the money, like in Europe and the OECD countries, on household necessities, so housing, transportation. Interestingly, they also mention food in the United States, and you don't see that in the OECD countries. And I think it's again because families are not so hard up. But if you ask people in the United States how they spend the money, food is often the first thing they mention. Uh, but that is, you know, that is the way things are here. Um, and again, there's no evidence in the United States that families spend money on alcohol and tobacco. We did a large study using data, looking at people in the room who are involved in that, using data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is a repeated cross-sectional, nationally representative data set. And so year after year, you can track how families spend money, and you can see how spending changes when the benefits are turned on or turned off. And there's no increase in alcohol and tobacco, but there is an increase in spending on the children's items, clothing, footwear, books, and toys. So yeah, the evidence is very consistent.
Yeah, and I think that's worth actually just sort of like, sitting with for a moment
Yeah.
because, it kind of, well, first it goes against the grain of just maybe folks who haven't thought about this too much and might just sort of hear sort of stereotypes or stigmas sort of in the news or in casual
Yeah.
conversation, but it's also, um, you're saying it's not just like one study, one-off thing. It's consistent, not just in the US studies, but
I
also
mean,
like
it's
worldwide.
20 studies in the OECD, and it's dozens of studies
Yeah.
of the expansion in the US. And I mean, a lot of people interpret these results as having to do with the fact that these things are called child benefits or they're called child allowances. Or during the 2021 expansion, they called it the child CTC, which was kind of unnecessary on one level because CTC means child tax credit. So you're calling it the child tax credit. But it was the branding. People wanted to get that word and the message out, this is for your children. And people get it.
Yeah. I think one of so as Jane mentioned, myself and colleagues at Columbia, we've done a lot of research on the 2021 child tax credit expansion. I had tried to round up a number of instances of, there was research coming out fast and
Yeah.
furious like during that year and tried to sort of synthesize it, what was coming out from us and researchers around the country. And yeah, again, there was evidence that, there was not spending on those items, but at the same time, you could see very clearly where money was going, even from studies of anonymized credit and debit,
Yeah.
things like
Yeah.
that, where you can't make up this data, even if you think a family might not sort of want to say
Yeah.
something in a survey. All of this other hard data that can't be manipulated. There was actually like, anonymized mobile phone location
Yeah.
data, all of this type of stuff. And if anything knows like what you're doing in your life, it's your phone. Like we know that. And the phones don't lie, unfortunately. But the phones didn't, show it either. And so it's just kind of really, I think useful to really hold up when there is rigorous
Oh, yeah.
evidence to like push back against things that
Yeah.
sort of take on a life of their own, but actually are not
Yeah.
really based
Yeah.
in what the research says.
And I think you also found that it wasn't just low income families who were spending money on things like food and
Right.
housing and transportation. It was middle income families as well.
Yeah.
Which makes perfect sense because anytime that we look at hardship,
Yeah.
having trouble paying bills, having trouble affording food, falling behind on your bills, having trouble with your housing costs, that's not just low income families. That
Right.
extends up to middle income families. And so likewise, the benefits were seen and being used for necessities, not just by low income families, but by middle income as well.
Yeah, food was by far, in a way, the most
Yeah.
consistently
Yeah.
top item
Yeah.
that folks were using.
Yeah.
But so, thinking about the ways then the families spent this money, if we know a lot of it actually went to sort of basic needs, and things like that, we would obviously it follows that you would expect to see some movement in poverty indicators, hardship indicators, and things like that. And we do know that we saw some of those like really stunning drops during 2021. You could walk us through a little bit of that, but I'd also be interested to know, do we also then tend to see sort of child poverty reduction and things like that in other countries, or was that a US sort of outlier experience again, or?
No. I mean, it's sort of, in some ways, it's kind of obvious. I mean, somebody was saying the other day, you kind of don't need a PhD to know that if you give people money, you're going to reduce poverty and income instability and hardship. And that's actually the case. And that's true in the OECD countries as well as in the United States. I mean, and the impact of the 2021 expansion was massive. So child poverty fell by almost half because of the expanded child tax credit to 5%. So a 5% child poverty rate, that's the lowest child poverty rate we've ever had in the United States. I mean, that's like on the level of Denmark and Finland. We've never been there. And it's just so tragic because when it turned off the expansion, then the child poverty rate more than doubled. I think it went up to 12%. And so you can see the effect of the benefit turning on and turning off. And likewise, reductions in hardship, reductions in food insecurity. So yeah, the evidence is very clear.
Yeah. And are child benefits usually associated with child poverty reduction in OECD
Oh yeah,
countries, like,
absolutely. Yeah.
across?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what I thought was, I mean, and again, we did see things like food insecurity and things like that drop in 2021, again, in the US specifically because families were using it for food. But I think one of the other really interesting pieces that you touch on in this book, and we've, folks who've been talking about child tax credit, child benefits for a while, are always really interested in sort of broader child well-being impacts. And the US had, unfortunately, like a very short window to try and move the needle on some things that maybe like you see after a
Mhm.
longer period of time. But again, I'd be interested to know, what do we know from countries who have had
Mhm.
these benefits in place for a while on sort of children's health or like well-being or development issues? And what does that tell us about what maybe either did happen here or could?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question because that is part of the motivation for having these child benefits is that it's not just going to reduce poverty today for children, but it's going to improve their well-being, their health, their development, not just today, but in the long run. And as you said, we can't really look at the long run effects of the 2021 expansion because that's only a few years ago, so we don't have long run evidence yet. But certainly from the OECD countries, we have very clear evidence that if you reduce child poverty, you transfer more benefits during childhood, kids have better health, they have better development, better test scores, better mental health, better behavior. And then we see that played out in the long run. So better health in adulthood, more productivity, more employment, less use of benefits, less crime. And we can't see that yet for the child tax credit expansions in the United States. But if we look at the long run evidence from the United States from programs like the expansion of mothers' pensions historically or food stamps, there's 3 or 4 papers that look at these long run benefits and show these kinds of improvements. And Irv Garfinkel and his colleagues who are here at the table have estimated the costs and benefits associated with these long run improvements. And the return on investment is like 10 to 1, 15 to 1. For every dollar that you spend on these benefits today, you yield benefits in the long run of $10 or $15 because of these improvements in health and these improvements in education, productivity, taxes paid, earnings, reductions in crime, and all of those other factors. And that really was the motivation for the subtitle of the book, A Smart Investment for America's Future. When I was presenting this, I was still drafting the manuscript, people were so struck by that return on investment. They said, you have to put that in the title. You have to talk about investment. So yeah, that's where the subtitle came from.
So credit to Irv.
Credit to Irv, yeah.
So I think one of the um, most striking things here is just, first of all, the sheer amount of evidence that there is like on this type of policy,
Yeah.
both here and abroad. But then also just circling back to one of your opening comments, which is one of the reasons why the US is an outlier and why we can't really call the child tax credit a child benefit right now is because we have that upside down structure where actually the lowest income
Mhm.
kids who could benefit it from the most are actually the ones who don't get it. And one of the major reasons why not is because the US sort of continues to insist on tying something that has child in the name um, to parental employment
Mhm.
and income. Um, and I think that it it feels to me, and you can correct me, I'd be interested to know if that's like accurate or not. It feels to me like the US is sort of like uniquely stuck on this like issue,
Yes.
like a little bit obsessed
Yeah.
with it. And like what does that mean? What are the implications of that? And what does the research sort of tell us about the connections between these types of policies and just sort of employment in general?
Yeah, I think we are uniquely hung up on it. I think some people think of these programs as being welfare and they have to be, you have to worry about welfare and work incentives. And in other countries, these are not welfare programs. Well, in this country, I mean, wherever they are, child benefits are not welfare. The welfare is a means tested program. If you're a low income family, you get welfare. And when your income goes up high enough, the welfare goes away. So it's a program that's only for low income families and it's conditioned on low incomes. And people do worry a lot about work incentives in welfare programs. Child benefits are universally available for families with children. They have nothing to do with employment or low incomes. So they're not welfare, but I think we sort of lack a term for what they are. So, academics talk about social assistance and social insurance. Social assistance is means tested welfare. Social insurance is something that you get as a matter of right. Um, but we don't really have that language for children. I mean, sometimes people talk about, um, there's one group of people who aren't expected to work. That's the elderly, and they get Social Security. There's another group of people in society who are not expected to work. Oh, yeah, they're children and they should get what would we call it? Social Security for children. So sometimes people use that kind of a language. But we seem not to have those conversations in the United States. And there is, I don't know, probably shouldn't use the word obsession, but it is pretty much what it
And
is.
to be fair, that's not in Jane's book. That's my word.
There is a preoccupation with
Yeah.
employment and employment incentives. So I have a big chapter in the book about employment, what we know about employment effects. And so in the OECD countries research, it really depends on what the policy is, who's being served, what the context is, what group you're looking at. So I think it's really more relevant to look at the US evidence and especially the evidence around the child tax credit expansion, the 2021 expansion. So there have been 13 studies of the employment effects of the 2021 expansion, and 11 of the 13 find no effects on parental employment. So 0. So does that mean that no parent changed their employment in response? Probably not. So there's a qualitative study by Angela Rashidi at AEI, and she finds that maybe it's like 90% of the families, actually nobody changed employment. Nobody changed their work hours. Nobody entered or left employment. Maybe 5% of families cut back their employment a little bit, and maybe 5% increased their employment. And so it's a wash. So that's how you get to a 0. And that makes a lot of sense to me, that there'd be some families who with this extra money, they can purchase childcare. They can get their car on the road. They can get a telephone. They can do whatever they need to do to get into employment. And there would be some other families, maybe they have young children, they can cut back work a little bit until their children are a little bit older. But in large part, there's no change in employment. So that's 11 of 13. Then there's 2 that find some decrease in employment for families headed with young children headed by less educated moms. But both of those studies, the evidence is a little bit inconsistent. So one of them finds that the decrease in employment starts before the benefit starts, and then employment increases again before the benefit turns off. So the timing doesn't really line up. And another one of the studies says, well, where should we find these effects? We should find them with the lowest educated women. So let's look at women with some college or less. But when they split out women with just high school and women with some college, it's the women with some college who decrease their employment, but the women with just high school don't. So why would that be? That the women who are lowest income, least educated, they don't change their employment, but the women with some college, they do reduce their employment. So again, it's not consistent.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I try to, as you just saw, I try to give equal time to those two studies, but their evidence really is not consistent. And then there's the 11 studies on the other side that find no effects. I mean, the caveat on that is the 2021 expansion was only 6 months, the monthly benefit. It was during COVID. So what would happen with a permanent expansion? It could be very different. But there's been a ton of simulation studies. And so those simulation studies use elasticities to measure how responsive employment will be. And there's a range of elasticities from women are not going to respond at all to like they're going to be super responsive. And even if you have women being super responsive and cutting back quite sharply, there's still tiny effects on parental employment. So either the effects are going to be zero or they're going to be tiny.
Yeah, which again, I think, is something that you wouldn't even necessarily know from sort of picking up the newspaper
No,
sometimes because that,
no,
the kind of
No.
focus, like,
no,
and what the evidence actually says are not always.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think, having this like solid research base there is like really important
Yeah.
for just decision making in general. Picking up on one theme that you actually said as part of the employment piece, just to kind of touch on like one last piece of evidence so folks know like if they want to learn more about this, they can find this in the book because I thought this was interesting. I know you and I had some side conversations about this. You talked about families with young children, maybe they might be one of the ones that you could potentially expect to see different things. We also saw, some interesting things in 2021 where the US, the first time with child tax credit, gave more
Mhm.
money to younger
Yeah.
kids. And actually, all of this is sort of became, much more relevant in terms of current debate in the last few months, in terms of just like talking about what, fertility issues writ large and like
Mhm.
what families sort of like need or may want or, could really benefit from when they're having a baby. There's a lot of costs
Yeah.
associated with
Yeah.
so can you talk a little bit about, you have a whole chapter actually dedicated to sort of fertility issues, and I think it's a fascinating
Yeah.
topic to have as part of this.
Yeah. I do have a
Wow.
whole chapter on fertility. It's one of my favorite chapters. It's the sleeper chapter. So when I was working on the book, I'm not going to name names, but a number of people said to me, "Why do you have a chapter on fertility? Like, it is not an issue. Like, it's just not an issue in the current debate." I said, "Well, but it sort of is an issue when you're talking about child benefits. A lot of countries have tried to use these things to raise fertility. And in some countries, people have been really worried about you're going to give people money and they're going to have more babies. So I think I need to have a chapter on it." And people were like, "Oh, well, you can, I guess you can, but it's not going to be very relevant." And then, fast forward, and here we are talking about baby bonuses and fertility and pronatalism and all that stuff. So I'm glad I did it. Um, so the received wisdom is there is nothing you can do to raise fertility. I mean, Julian, Tyler, and I were talking about this yesterday. The number of countries that have tried throwing a lot of money at families, and yet fertility keeps going down or stays flat. But you can't really tell from that that the benefits aren't making a difference because you don't know what would have happened to the trends in the absence of those benefits. So you need more rigorous studies. And so the more rigorous studies, yeah, okay, in general, tax changes, benefits don't have much effect on fertility. That's true. And child benefits likewise have, little or no effect on fertility. But there is one form of benefit, these large lump sum birth grants, where you say, or baby bonuses, where you say to families, "You have a new baby and we're going to give you 3,000 euros, or we're going to give you $5,000. Those things do actually have an effect on fertility. So families have more children and they have fewer abortions. So that is what's in the research. And I was really surprised to see that because it just completely contradicted everything I knew from the popular press and literature about there being no effects on fertility. And it's not just one country, it's Quebec, it's Switzerland, it's Australia, it's Japan, it's South Korea, and it's Spain. So where countries have turned these policies on, turned them off. So there is something there. And so that is another piece of the
Yeah.
evidence.
Yeah. I'm conscious of the time because I want to throw it out open to the audience. And I think just one last topic to kind of cover before we do that in case it comes up is obviously just tying everything that we've walked through in terms of the evidence to actually, as I mentioned at the start, and Jane did as well, we're actually sitting right now in June 2025 in the context
Mhm.
of, a child tax, a very large bill that does a lot of things. Um, but part of it would actually affect the child tax credit moving forward very specifically. And so I'll just, sort of take like a moderator's like prerogative for a moment to just like briefly review the state of play so that we're kind of all on the same
Yeah.
page. We have the big bill from the first Trump administration, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, expiring at the end of this year. Part of that included the child tax credit expansion that was in there. So regardless of who was in power this year, it was going to be an issue to be grappled with. Um, we also, and if nothing is done, essentially the child tax credit reverts back to $1,000 per child. But since 2017, when that last bill was passed, we obviously have all the evidence for 2021
Mhm.
expansion. We have actually quite a lot of states that have now been doing things inspired actually by the 2021 federal expansion. We have a wide range of bills actually from Democrats and Republicans that would expand the
Yeah.
federal child tax credit in different ways. We had the now Vice President Vance during the campaign last summer identified that he would see a value in something like a $5,000 child tax credit. And actually, he's
All children.
for all children. He actually made a specific point that he didn't, it was something to the effect of he didn't see the sense of separating out
Mm.
access for lower income kids versus higher income kids. And so, we also then had an election that was dominated, in part by cost of living concerns. So it was kind of all of these things taken together that even under Republican trifecta, it actually stands to reason that if when this big bill was moving, you actually might see something pretty meaningful on the child tax credit. But when this bill finally dropped, in terms of specific legislative language and then moved through the House quite quickly, it was sort of the reverse. We actually didn't see very well, we didn't really see much of an expansion of the child tax credit in general. One of actually the specific new provisions is a new exclusion of kids who currently are eligible. So in sort of continuing in the vein of sort of targeting children with immigrant parents, um, there's a provision that our colleagues here at the Center on Poverty and some other partner groups identified could knock out about 4.5 million US citizen children, legal permanent resident children from access to the child tax credit now moving forward. Um, and we do see, as you mentioned, a small potential increase in the credit from $2,000 to 2,500 per child, but we actually don't see sort of an expansion of eligibility otherwise. And so it actually sort of, has the risk of sort of increasing actually the kids who might be left out. And we'll actually be having some new analysis ready on this soon. And so, we'll make it available as soon as that's public. Um, but I think like in light of all this, how do you read these current policy developments um, in the context of all the evidence that you just spent, you know,
Mm.
a long time researching and also just, reviewing for us here? Like, how do they sit sort of together in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's like on the one hand, I'm so heartened by the support for a more generous child tax
Mhm.
credit. And it is bipartisan. There is bipartisan interest in raising the value of the child tax credit. And, it's $2,500 in the House bill. The Republican proposals that are out there are close to $5,000 and, higher credits for young children. Like they got the message, and the Democrats have been there for a long time. So I'm so heartened by the support for making the credit more generous. But on the other hand, it's just so discouraging to see the lack of understanding of the importance of extending eligibility. So, currently, 1/4 of American children don't get the full $2,000. Some of them get nothing. Some of them get only a partial credit because their families are too poor. So that is just crazy. And if it's raised further, if the value is raised further without extending eligibility, even more kids are going to be left out. Like we're not allowed to say the number because the report hasn't been released, but it's going to be more. Um, so yeah, it's absolutely clear. The whole last chapter of the book, I present all these different estimates of all the different proposals, and it's just really clear whatever proposal you're talking about, if you raise benefits without extending eligibility, it's not going to help poor kids, and it could even leave them further behind. And I'm saying poor kids, but we're talking about the bottom quarter or more of the income distribution. It's not just poor kids; it's low income kids and middle income kids. So, honestly, if I was only going to do one thing, either raise the benefits or extend eligibility, I'd extend eligibility. The most important thing is to include the low and middle income kids who were left out. And then we can talk about raising the benefits. But if money is short and we only can spend a small amount of money in the bill, you want to spend it on eligibility. Now, I said if money is short because money's not short, apparently, because we're spending a heck of a lot of money on this bill. And there's like giveaways for everybody. So in that context, it's all the more appalling that there's not enough money to extend eligibility. So it's not about money. It's not about we can't afford it. It's about this sort of moral, fear, this fear of, oh my God, people are going to stop working, and it's this welfare framing. We're going to be going back on welfare reform, and child benefits have nothing to do with welfare.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know how we get that across. If it's, I thought using a different name, calling them child benefits, and the fact that it's a foreign name is intentional.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't think I use the word welfare anywhere in the book because it's not about welfare. So let's get out of that frame.
Yeah.
And let's get into a different frame.
Yeah. Like people are at the wrong party. Sure.
Yeah. And they have good intentions. They have good intentions.
So I think on that note, we're almost perfectly at time, which is actually not always common for me. So I'm gonna take those 2 minutes as a win for today.
And here's the book. There's a great
yeah,
cover.
exactly.
You get to see the blurbs on the back if you buy the book. You can order it from Russell Sage. People have asked me, when's it going to be out? Is it out in September or is it out now? No, it's out. You can order it now. Like I ordered it and I got a box delivered. So you can order a whole box. Or you can order just a single copy, but if you order it, it will come.
I'd be happier if you order a whole box.
Yeah, go for it. It's a good gift item. And then when you go and visit your legislators, you can hand them the book.
Sure.
You guys need to read this.
True. So we know there was a lot of people online. There's a lot of people in the room, and there were a lot of co-sponsors of this event. So again, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for joining us today. You can find a lot of the research, that Jane mentioned on the Center on Poverty and Social Policy website, but more importantly in the book. But most importantly, if there's anything that you'd like to talk about, follow up with Jane or myself or any of our colleagues here, we're always happy to chat on this topic and more. We have new research coming out regularly, so you can keep up with us on our website. And basically, Jane, just congratulations. It's a wonderful achievement, and it was wonderful to be in conversation. So thank you.
Thank you for being.